I think this is such an interesting play, Anne, because, you know, deciding how to set it is phenomenally. It was a very interesting idea, and I just think, you know, what was so great was that the two of us just sat down and started talking and tossing ideas around. And I think one of the earliest decisions was not to try to be site-specific, you know, in other words, not to try to set this play in the Mideast or Africa or Eastern Europe or any place where conflict and war was obvious, but rather to take a kind of page out of Euripides, who had a specific incident that inspired this play, but chose to set the play in the mythical Trojan war times, hundreds of years before his own time, in order to, in a way, to distance it, but also as people watched the play from the hillsides, the 20,000 people sitting there watching this very political play, to recognize that he was speaking about what happened a year ago in terms of the Athenian.
I assume the costuming is more significant than the set, but if
to some degree, the set, we've taken a nod from the Greeks in having a very simple set. It won't look specifically like anywhere, but it will look as universal as the play is, in that the population looks almost biblical out of necessity. And the army looks quite modern, but not specifically modern, not any actual nation, but simply every man's army and every man.
When we were looking at this, when we said, okay, we're not going to set it in this country, that country, we're not going to try to replicate Greek theater. We don't really know that much about how it was done, and specifically not, you know, in Euripides' time, which has a very different flavor of just a few decades earlier, the Aeschylus that would have been done. We have a 500-seat theater, so we don't need masks, because it's a small space, and we don't need them to have bigger expressions and accessibility to a large audience on a hillside. We don't need them to delineate character, because instead of 3 men playing all the parts, we've got all these wonderful women doing it. And the play feels so human and modern and contemporary. At the same time, it's 2,400 years old. Women are still wearing clothes they've worn for hundreds of years. There's still this so many women in the world are still, to some extent, chattel. They still are bereft of power. And indeed, the women in the Trojan women are powerless. All they have is the power of the poetry they speak, of their grieving. And so many of them are dressed head to foot, their bodies completely covered, headscarves, things to conceal and protect them. And so that clothing is ageless. So by clothing them in that way, in clothes that we do see nowadays, when we look at this footage, we also see something that is ancient and modern and restrictive. And the men have, as John is saying, that brute force, that the up-to-date military equipment, and yet something I remember you saying, John, is so many elements like the helmet and the protective flak jackets.
Yes, they've been at this war for 10 years. Mm-hmm. They've been away from home for 10 years, and the Trojans have been locked into their city for 10 years. So they've kind of run out of laundry detergent. The power sources have all gone. I mean, speaking sort of facetiously, but it is a sense of deprivation on both sides, so that the victims of war are not just the Trojan women, but the Greek soldiers as well. And their fine gloss is gone.
What I love about what John's done is that there are elements in the military costumes which suggest today that are still elements that they would have worn then.
Classical. Absolutely classical. Helmets have hardly changed. Riot gear is almost exactly like what people had in 400 BC. The great rectangular shields, all that stuff, only we make it out of durable plastic. But the silhouette hasn't changed, the attitude hasn't changed, and the dehumanized aspect of the whole thing hasn't changed.
I think what we're trying to establish is that the women have this timeless lack of power, but war is always modern. And war, what we're trying to say is, as you watch the play, we're not changing the sense of location being the Trojan War, which wasn't Greece, it was Troy. And that we think in terms of that war, just as Euripides said it in another time. We let the women and the story live in Troy, but as you look at the women, you see that they're in the clothes clothing they've worn for all those hundreds of years and haven't changed. And you also see the men in a more very modern military uniforms, so that we have both a sense of connecting back to time and to many different places, but also connecting to immediate, brute, and modern images.